Good morning, Year 3. As promised, another video for English. We are going to be reading a little bit more of Stig of the Dump, focusing on the chapter 2 called Digging with Stig. What I'd like you to do as I'm reading, I'd like you to note down some words that are unfamiliar to you. I will point out a couple as I'm reading, but also if you just write them down as we go along, and you can create a bank for the activity afterwards. So if you remember, at the end of chapter 1 yesterday, Barney had come back to his grandmother's house. He told them that he'd been with Stig, and they didn't quite believe him. They thought that Stig was an imaginary character. But then Barney decided that he was going to go back to Stig the next day. So chapter 2, Digging with Stig. It was a fine autumn morning, and the grass was very wet with dew outside. Barney pushed his breakfast down as fast as he could manage. "What do you want to do today?" his grandmother asked as she drank her coffee. "I have to go to Sevenoaks this morning. Do you want to come?" Barney's heart sank. Go in to Sevenoaks? Well, it was all right if he had nothing else to do, but he had to go and see Stig. "No, thank you, Granny," he said. "I don't think I want to go to Sevenoaks." "You'll be quite happy just messing about here?" asked his grandmother. "Yes, thank you. I just want to mess about with Stig." "Oh, I see," Granny smiled. "With your friend Stig? Well, Mrs. Pratt will be here all morning, so if you like, you can stay with her. And with Stig, of course." Don't think she believed him, do you? Lou said she would like to go into town, as she wasn't particularly interested in playing with Stig. Barney knew, from the way that she said it, was that she still thought that Stig was only a pretend friend. But that was all right. If she didn't want to meet Stig, she needn't. "Can I go out now?" he asked. "All right," said Granny. "Put on your boots." She called after him as he shot through the door. Barney's feet made dark prints in the dew as he headed across the lawn towards the chalk pit. That's the word you could write down, dew. Then he stopped and stood still in the middle of the lawn. Suppose he didn't find Stig after all. The sun was bright, yellow leaves fluttered down from the elm tree onto the grass. A robin puffed its breast on a rose tree and squeaked at him. Barney suddenly wasn't sure that he believed in Stig himself. It wasn't a Stiggish day, like yesterday when he had fallen down the pit. He had fallen, hadn't he? He felt the bump on the back of his head. Yes, that was real enough. He'd fallen and bumped his head. And then what? Funny things did happen when you bumped your head. Perhaps you only saw Stigs when you fell and bumped your head. He didn't think he wanted to fall over the cliff again on purpose and bump his head again. That would be a little bit silly, wouldn't it? Was Stig a person you could just go and play with like the children at the end of the road at home? He had to find out. But he didn't want to go to the chalk pit and find nothing. He stood with his hands in his pockets in the middle of the lawn, his fingers playing with something hard in his left-hand pocket of his jeans. What do you think this might be, Year 3? He remembered something and pulled out the thing he had in his hand. Of course, the flint. That's another word you could write down, flint. He looked at it glinting in the sunlight, like a black diamond with its chipped pattern. He'd seen Stig make it. There was no mistake about that. Of course, Stig was real. He set off again at a run, climbed the fence into the paddock and waded through the long grass to the other side. Waded, another word. The copse around the edge of the chalk pit looked dark beyond the sunlit grass. In the middle of the paddock, he found himself slowing down and stopping again. Something at the back of his mind was telling him that he'd seen the pictures of chip flints in books, and real ones in museums, and that they were made thousands of years ago by rough people who weren't alive any longer. People found them and put them in cases with notices on them. Perhaps he'd just found this one and imagined everything else. And supposing he hadn't imagined Stig, was he the sort of person who liked people coming to play? Well, he told himself all he really wanted to do was look at the place where he had fallen over yesterday. Have another look down the dump. There was that bicycle there anyway. He walked to the edge of the paddock. Another word we could write, paddock. A clump of brown grass jumped up from under his feet and bounced away towards a bramble patch, showing a white tail and two long ears. Barney's heart bumped, but it was only a rabbit. He ran after it, but he had disappeared into the thick of the undergrowth. Feeling bolder, he climbed over the fence and went carefully towards the edge of the pit, making sure that he kept near a big tree that seemed to be well anchored to the side and peeked over. He could see the patch of raw earth and white chalk where the ground had given way under him, the dangling creepers lowered down, and the scatter of broken chalk at the bottom. He craned over to see the hole he had made in the roof of the den. There was a pile of branches and rubbish against the foot of the cliff, but no gaping hole. Not a sign of a hole, of a roof, of a den, of a Stig. He listened. A blackbird, turning over dry leaves in the search of worms, was making noise, much too big for itself, but apart from the pit, that was silent and empty. Barney walked away from the edge of the pit and climbed over the fence into the sunshine of the paddock, thinking hard. He looked at the stone in his hand. He felt the bump on his head. He had seen the raw patch where the ground had given way. He remembered crashing through a sort of roof, leaving a big gaping hole, and yet there wasn't a hole. So he couldn't have made one. But he must have landed somewhere, and that he had a clear picture in his head. Looking up through a hole in the side of the cliff, and the clouds passing over the sky, and suddenly, as he stood in the middle of the paddock, he gave a big jump as the answers came to him, like getting a sum right. If there wasn't a hole, it was because of somebody, and they had mended it. Stig wasn't the sort of person to leave a large hole in his roof for a long time. Not his friend Stig. All at once everything fitted together. Yesterday's adventure on that Stiggish sort of afternoon, the bump on his head, the flint, and his bright autumn morning when he was going to visit his friend Stig, and he was quite clear in his head now what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. He set off running back to the garden. Presents for Stig. When you visited people this time of year, you always brought something from the garden. Tomatoes you couldn't bottle, or apples you couldn't have room to store. He looked round at a big old apple tree for windfalls. There were some big ones, difficult to manage without a basket, but he stuffed them into his shirt, making sure there weren't any wasps in them. What else? He saw a line of carrots, his favourite fruit. He was allowed to pull up the carrots. They were good for his teeth, so he heaved up a good few sized ones and rubbed the earth off them with his fingers. Then he had an idea, and he ran to the tool shed where he found a ball of garden string. It was all right just to borrow it. Back he ran again, across the garden, over the fence, across the paddocks, over into the copse, and through the brambles of the dead leaves to the edge of the pit. He sat himself comfortably on the trunk of the tree that curved out over the pit like the neck of a camel, and looked carefully at what he could see. There was the broken edge of the cliff. There were the trailing creepers. There at the bottom were the scattered lumps of chalk that had come down with him, and now that he was really looking at it, he could see a piece of new linoleum. Well, not exactly new. Nothing in the dump was new, but it looked as if he had been there not long ago, because it wasn't covered with moss like things that had been there for a long time, and he could see at one side of his pile of branches and things that was sticks lean to roof, a faint path in the bottom of the pit that led to the front of the den. He found at the end of the ball of the string, and he tied a bunch of carrots to it. Then he began to pay out the string with the carrots dangling on the end towards the bottom of the pit. He hoped it was long enough. There always seems to be miles of string in a ball, but it dwindled and dwindled as he lowered and the carrots down, until he was afraid that it wouldn't reach the bottom. Bother! A cobble, a regular spider's nest of tangled string, appeared, and he had to stop it and uncobble it. At last, with a few feet in hand, the carrots were swinging on a level with the Stig's front door. Barney's seat was not quite above it, so he had to get the carrots swinging to and fro all the way beneath him, until they were actually knocking at the door like 5 pink fingers. Barney was bubbling so much with the laughter inside him at the trick that he was playing on Stig that he forgot to be dizzy. "Stig!" he called down the pit. "Morning, Stig! I'm knocking at your front door!" And suddenly, out of the stack of branches, appeared the tousled head of Stig, and stayed there wagging to and fro, following the swinging carrots like a cat watching a pendulum. Barney nearly fell off the tree with laughing. "Hello, Stig," he called. "Good morning, I'm Barney. You remember? How are you?" Stig looked up, and for a moment Barney felt quite frightened at the ferocious scowl on his face, and was glad to be high up out of his reach. Should he have played a trick on Stig? Perhaps he didn't have what the grown-ups called a sense of humour. Did Stigs have sense of humours? But when Stig made out who it was sitting above his face, suddenly changed. His big white teeth showed in a broad grin. He waved both arms over his head, and he jumped about in the bottom of the pit to show how pleased he was. "Have a carrot, Stig," called Barney. "For you," he said, pointing to the Stig. "To eat," he added. "Good for your teeth," he said, making biting movements. Stig leapt up at the carrots as they swung past, caught them, looked at them closely, smelt them, and put one in his mouth and crunched it. He looked up at Barney, smiling with his mouth full, to show that he liked his present. Then he made signs which clearly meant that Barney was to come down. So I'm going to leave it there, year 3. So Barney is being asked to come down back into the pit. So what we're going to do now, I'd like to pause the video from me, and I want you to watch the video that is on the sheet that I've put on the class page. Once you've watched that, I'd like to watch this next section. So this next section, we are going to be looking at a word, the meaning, and a sentence. Now the word I'm going to be looking at is the word rickety. It was in the chapter. And I've put it in this box next to word rickety. Now the meaning of the word rickety. I'm going to go onto Word Hippo. The link for that is on the sheet that I do for you every day. So you can press the link, and on Word Hippo you can find the meaning of words. It is a dictionary, it's an online dictionary. So type in your word that you want to find the meaning of, and you can write it in this next box. So the word rickety means it's an object which isn't strong, so not strong or sturdy, and it's not strong or sturdy because of the way it's been built and constructed, or maybe that people haven't looked after it once it's been built. So because of poor building or upkeep. Now, what I'd like to do in this bottom section, I'd like to write a sentence with the word that you have chosen. So I'm going to write a sentence with my word rickety in. So, my sentence, what could I write? I want to include something about me. So, Miss Dunn walked across the rickety. Now this is where I'm including my word rickety, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to underline my word to show that I've used it. Rickety, comma, old bridge. Now if you have realised, I've included my expanded noun phrase there. I'm describing the bridge, which is my noun, and I'm using different adjectives to describe. Miss Dunn walked across the rickety old bridge before she got to the glorious, it's going to be a squeeze, sunset. So Miss Dunn walked across the rickety old bridge before she got to the glorious sunset. Now I have finished on another noun phrase. I've used glorious as my adjective and sunset as my noun. What I'd like you to do, I'd like you to create your sentences based on the story of Stig of the Dump. So think about what has happened and see if you can include that word that you've got the definition for in a sentence based on Stig of the Dump. I hope that makes sense, year 3. Good luck, see you soon!